Welcome to the U.S. Artist Visa panel. Thank you, APAP, for giving us the opportunity to talk about this evergreen topic. I have done so many primer, this is what you need to know to get a visa, that I'm tired of that topic, and I didn't want to do it again this year. So if you don't know anything about visas, go to the Artists from Abroad website because it's all there. I also, if you were here yesterday, you would have gotten an update on advocacy efforts that are happening on the legislative session, where we talked about a lot of the work that's being done right now to make the process better, more streamlined, more equitable. So I'm not going to go into that. What we are going to talk about today with this illustrious panel of awesome humans is we're going to talk about the process as it currently stands, kind of in terms of the lived experience of being a presenter, an agent, or an artist working within it. And it's going to be a kind of an interplay between how it feels and how the visa process affects all of our work, and then strategies about how to approach the problems that that come up in the process. So hopefully this will be very on point for the needs and interests of the people in the room. Normally I say let's do questions as we go, but it's a huge room and there's a lot of you here, so we're gonna leave some time at the end to do questions all en masse. So I'm gonna be an active moderator. So I've got a bunch of questions for my colleagues here, and I'm going to get responses from them, and then I will probably respond with some information that I can offer in terms of strategies from my experience. My name is Matthew Covey. I'm the executive director of Tamizdat, which is a nonprofit based here in New York that works on issues of artist mobility, which usually means something having to do with visas, getting artists traveling internationally. I'm also an immigration attorney. That's what I do with my life. So I'd like to let our panelists introduce themselves. That usually works better. So starting at the far end, Mahmood, can you tell us about what you do?
My name is Mahmood Shaikh. I'm an agent at a company called Concerted Efforts. I represent mostly artists that are in the indie rock sphere. The company represents a broad spectrum of artists, mostly US based, but many European and one Asian-based artist as well.
Paula?
Hi, I'm Paula Abreu. Thank you for having me here. So honored. I'm the director of presented programming at McCarter Theater Center. Some of you may know me from Summer Stage. My former colleague from Summer Stage, Danny G. I used to work at Summer Stage. I was there for 10 years. I'm originally from Brazil, so I did navigate all the visa things for myself, and I've done many visa for many artists. And now at McCarter, I'm presenting all disciplines, all genres. It's a performing arts center located on the campus of Princeton University. It's beautiful down there. Please come visit. It's only an hour and a half from New York. And that's it. I've been there for a year and a half now. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Juliana Ronderos. I'm a performing artist, songwriter, and producer from Bogota, Colombia. And I have been living in New York for 10 years under O1 visas. I'm an independent artist. I make like indie alternative music with world and Caribbean music. I studied jazz. And I have had multiple O1 visas and have done this process many times.
Thank you. So I'm going to stay kind of on script, which is not normal for me because we have a pretty limited amount of time, and I want to make sure that everybody has a lot of time to say what they need to say, which means me not rambling. So unlike most countries around the world, the US's protectionist visa policy creates a significant barrier for international artists and US agents and US presenters. Often obtaining the legal visas can take up to 6 months, sometimes more, and cost well over $5,000 to get an ensemble into the US. This is an enormously challenging impediment to the US cultural sector and industry, and it makes it very difficult to develop international artists in the US. I want to start with a question to Paula. As a presenter, how does an artist visa status or lack of a visa status impact your willingness to work with them?
Hey. Okay, good. So it's a broad question, right? It's case by case. It's very hard to address. Sometimes I've worked with artists that didn't have a visa, that we worked with the artists to get a visa, and I've worked with other artists that unfortunately we had to pass because there wasn't enough time, or I didn't feel that they were committed to getting a visa. And it's important to say that I think all of you know this, but a presenter doesn't work when it comes to visa and bringing artists from abroad. We have to work with a group of presenters, right? It's very hard if it's just one presenter. So that's the information I try to get. Are you working with other people? Are you committed? Do you have funding? If I feel that if they don't have a visa and don't have any of that, then it makes it much harder. But if they have at least one piece of the puzzle, even though they don't have the visa, it can be easier.
Right. That makes sense. I'm going to change the order here for a second because I feel like that leads directly to you. As an agent, sort of the same question. How important is it for your artists to have long-term visas, have to go into the relationship with visas? I sort of, Paula's comment sort of teased that up, which is like, if you're going to work with an artist, is that the first priority?
It kind of depends on where we are in the timeline, with the indie and touring rock world, the advanced window planning time up until recently was much shorter than maybe in some of the performing arts spheres. So now when we are looking at like a 6 to 12 month window on planning a tour, we can look to get that long-term visa. But there have been situations in the past where a support tour or a festival that's next month or in 2 months comes up, and if you didn't have that standing visa, you couldn't do it, or there was a financial barrier or just bureaucracy timeline barrier that became unsurmountable. So now it is very important to have a long-term visa, and if there's a new foreign artist that already has a visa in place, that is a check in the pro column as far as beginning working with them. Beginning working with a new developing artist without a visa, that's where the financial realities of visa costs and what an artist can earn in their developmental stage comes to be. So if there already is a long-term visa, or this now looking at the option of O1 versus the P1 visa, which historically for me, that's been the focus, has been the P1, either tour time frame being tour oriented, or like 1 year, 2 years, if you have that supporting evidence that you're actively working here as an artist, and also that you're an artist that has the press or recorded material to show to the USCIS that you are a viable artist. So short version, very important to have a long-term visa, but in this sphere, sometimes it's a chicken and egg scenario.
Just to fill in some information, if you're not totally familiar with the process, there are two broad classifications that artists use to come into the U.S. The P visas and the O visas. The maximum duration of the P visa is 1 year. The maximum duration of the O visa is 3 years. But those are the maximums. And so a lot of the game that you get into is trying to figure out, if you're going to go through all this expense and hassle to get these employment visas, it doesn't cost any more to get 3 years than it does to get a week. So the process of working with an artist and their agent and their presenters working together to figure out how can we get the long-term visa for the artist in a legal way, which means not producing fraudulent documentation and itineraries that aren't real. And if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about.
We prefer to say intended rather than fraudulent.
You could say intended.
Intended.
Yeah, well,
but this brings up a good point too, in that there was a lot of confusion in the process of what you would have to show, how much activity within that year you would have to show that's contracted for performances versus promotional or recording.
Right.
And there was this idea that it had to be X amount of performances every Y number of weeks, and that's not the case.
I'm going to do this is where I said I'm going to throw more information in here. The notion that you have to have no more than specific gaps is not law. It's not technically true, although can be a useful rule of thumb. The issues you have to show that you have employment And it can be shown by demonstrating that you have a bunch of dates, but it can also be shown that you have a relationship with an agent. So this is like the big reveal that continues to be the big reveal to our sector, is that if you can show that you have a contractual relationship with an agent over a long period of time, like a year contract if it's a P, or a 3-year contract if it's an O, or a publishing company, it doesn't have to be an agent, publishing company, record label, whatever it might be, then the documentation to show that you actually have engagements, performances planned, becomes secondary. And that does not have to be confirmed in the way that it does if that's the only evidence that you have of employment. This gets incredibly complex and tees up a lot of problems for people who are doing this themselves. So get good advice about this. But I just wanted to say that there is an alternative to creating fraudulent itineraries. And that's important because they do check. And if you are caught, it is a major headache for the artist and for the person who's filing the petition. With that.
Can I add one thing to that? The idea of these intended documents, they are checking with promoters and presenters. Like, so if you present information that you're doing an intended show, if that presenter isn't aware of it, they may get a call like, "Are you working with Matthew's band?" And they'll be like, "Who's Matthew?" And that's where, so the reality is, it's not just a fictional document going into the ether. These are being checked on.
Right. Juli, this is a question about conversations amongst Juli. It's been so long, I still can't get it right. So within the community of artists, because I know you work with a lot of international artists and you're in a community of them, what's the sense there? And this is where we really go into lived experience. When international artists are looking to build their careers in the US, what's your sense of the point at which they should start thinking about their visa strategy?
I think very early on.
Okay.
I come from a path where it was slightly easier because I graduated college and I had an OPT. So during that 1 year of OPT, I played like 200 shows and got all the press I could in this blog era, so like hundreds of blogs, and that helped me get my first visa. But I do know of a lot of people who've tried to get the visas, being from Colombia or being from like South America. And you have to start thinking of it because you need to gather everything. It is so much information. You need to know all your press, like the shows you're playing, have good relationships with promoters. I'm not sure how it works. Like, I guess you would need an agent here to be able to show that intended work, because it ends up being a chicken and an egg dilemma. It's like, how do you get a show in the US if you don't have the visa? But to get the visa, you have to show that people want to contract you in the US. So, I mean, unless you're huge in Latin America, you're the biggest artist, and they obviously want you to headline Coachella, like they want Balvin, like, then that makes sense. They can get a green card. But for independent artists, it's difficult. So you have to try and get the most press, the most shows, and
it's important to know that the press that you need to show, so that when you're filing a petition, there's two things you have to prove. You have to prove that you've got employment. There's a contractual reason why you need to be in the US, the artist, you meaning the artist. And you have to have documentation to show that you meet the standard of that classification. So if it's a P1, are you a member of an ensemble with sustained international renown? If you're an O1, are you an artist of extraordinary ability? So these are two separate things you have to prove. And it's important, in speaking to your chicken egg thing, you don't have to show that you have renown in the US. You just you have to show that you have renown somewhere. And so in that sense, you can, if you have developed your reputation elsewhere and you've got strong press, strong presence, you can use that to prove that you can come into the US. The interesting thing, I think, and this speaks to another whole other panel we could do, showcasing is kind of an exception in many situations. An artist can come to the US to do a showcase in many situations, an official showcase event where they are performing to the industry without having an employment visa. So that begs this question of, at what point do you stop showcasing on ESTA or on a tourist visa and take the plunge? And oftentimes we work very closely with South by Southwest, and this becomes a huge issue there because, like, if an artist or if a label is going to bring an artist to perform at South by Southwest, the presumption is like, I hope they get an agent, I hope they get a publisher, I hope this takes off in a fairly short time frame. So do we also make the investment to do the visa before South by Southwest in order to make sure that if it works, we're ready to roll, which is sort of what you were talking about. But it's a huge investment, and a lot of artists perform at a showcase event, come to the US, and nothing ever happens, and then that investment would be lost. So it's a tough one. I think if you're a manager or a label, you look at it one way. I think if you're an artist, you sort of look at it a different way because you're thinking like, well, it may not work with this label, but I want to get into this market.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because artists should like think of getting that visa. I know it's like expensive. So if you do it with time, you're saying how far ahead. First off, you don't have to pay premium processing, which ends up being a lot of the times, one of the most expensive things. It's like $2,500 to get your decision very quickly. So if you have the leading time to do it, maybe it's worth having that investment, because then I go to Mahmood and I'm like, hey, I want an agent in the US. He knows he doesn't have to deal with the headache of my visa. He's like, I can just call these festivals and say, hey, here's an artist who's doing great here, and the music fits your vibe. I think it makes it maybe easier. So I think like as an independent artist, and then that allows you not to go to Mahmood, but I can go to another agent, and I can go to Paula and be like, hey,
Not
can
that
you present me?
Wouldn't want to go to Mahmood, of
No,
course.
I mean, I would love to. I mean, I'm looking for an agent, actually, putting it out there. I just left my
You saw
agent.
it here.
But yeah, you can go to, like, if you're independent, you can talk to venues, you can talk to different bands, be like, hey, can I open on tour for you? And you're able to do it. So I think like getting your own visa is important more than like having a label or a publisher thinking of getting you the visa.
Yes.
I don't know if this is something we're going to address later, but unfortunately, the main barrier of entry here is the cost in the U.S. for an artist who, are working on pretty thin budgets as it is. The cost of an artist visa, O1 or P1, and this is a different panel, but like, how can we go about addressing that and adjusting that? Domestically, not necessarily from the home territory doing the funding, I don't know if that's something we can get into.
I could get on my little soapbox for a second if you want.
Podium.
There is an actual podium. So a year ago, there was rumor that the visa fees were going to increase substantially. The whole world went bananas about that, which was great because it actually was noticed. There were something like 40,000 comments to the Federal Register, and they postponed that decision. It's unclear if that's a permanent postponement or if it's going to come up again this year or whether it's going to come back changed. But that is a significant piece of the fees. It's not the biggest part of the fees, and even if they do increase the fees, it's not the biggest part. The premium processing fees are about to go up again. So that is a huge part if you're coming last minute, if you're trying to expedite because you've got that offer. But my soapbox is somewhat self-defeating. The biggest cost in all of this is often the legal fees. And while oftentimes legal fees are bananas and you should question them if they're really, really high, it is a really expensive and time-consuming process. And even like we work really hard to keep our fees low as possible, and they're still way too expensive. And to me, Mahmood, the issue here is that, and the advocacy we focus on is trying to find ways to make the process more transparent, more reliable, and just a process that's easier. Because 20 years ago, most people didn't hire lawyers to do this work. Most people had their intern do it. And now that doesn't work very well. And I think if we can work together, and APAP's working on this with a lot of other arts organizations, bring down the standard of proof and make it easier to get these petitions approved, then the lawyers aren't going to be as necessary or the fees aren't going to be as high because it's not that many hours that go into it. So to me, that's the nut, is how do we make the process simpler and more streamlined so you don't need to pay lawyers $5,000 to get an O1.
So you're saying lawyers are the issue?
Lawyers are the problem? Yes. But I think we're used to that in this country, lawyers being the problem. We've sort of touched on this a little bit, but I think it bears digging in a little bit more. One strategy for obtaining a long-term visa is applying for a visa through a U.S. entity with a long-term relationship with the artist, like a label or an agent or publisher. So the contract underlying the visa application, the petition, is not an individual performance date, but it's rather a long-term contractual relationship between the artist and, say, the talent agent. One important consideration with this, however, now the light turns on you. One important consideration with this is that when you file a petition based on a relationship between an artist and, say, an agent, in many ways and in many circumstances, that ties the artist to that agent. So if your relationship with the agent falls apart, or if the artist's relationship with the agent falls apart, that may invalidate the visa. For an artist, for an agent, that could be a good thing because it sort of indentures the artist to you. For an artist, that can be a bad thing because it might mean you get stuck with an agent that's not so great. And I guess what I'm wondering is, I'll start with you, Mahmood. As an agent, do you see this as an advantage? Do you see this as something that you've experienced and something that helps build a deeper relationship? Like if you're putting the money up for somebody's visa and you're the petitioner, that creates more depth in that relationship? Or do you see that as, looking at your colleagues, not you, of course, or people in your industry, a potential for abuse?
Well, as far as my firsthand experience, the idea of doing a longer term, the O1, up to 3-year visa, without evidentiary, actual performances booked, I've yet to do that route, and I see the advantage of it. And yeah, obviously that's a little bit of a check and balance, a little bit of a protection. So yeah, I guess that would be an advantage, but aesthetically, ethically, as an agent and someone involved in the arts, I don't want to think of that a worst case scenario of from the starting point of well, if this artist fires me, I'm gonna drop their support. It adds this negative space, which it is a reality that is a protection. I haven't been in a scenario where that's come up, but it's also no different than if someone, is working for IBM in whatever territory and they have a work-supported visa, and if they lose that job or leave that job, they're not going to have that, or if you're a student or whatever. So in reality, yeah, it is a protection, but I haven't really thought of it as this almost a vindictive route,
Sure. No, that makes
intended.
sense. That makes sense. Juli, what do you feel about that? Is that something that comes up, or is that? I'm thinking about this because in my work, because we deal with so many cases, we do see stuff like this where it's I want to dump my agent, but I can't because then I've got to do that. It does happen, but I don't think it probably happens much. But I don't know.
Obviously, if there's a scenario where the artist and agent are not seeing eye to eye or it's not a good fit, then you make a split. It's a reality. No one wants to be indentured in. This is. It just doesn't. For me, it doesn't sit well that way. And if there is a matter of a financial investment, maybe there's a settlement that can happen. Again, the O1 long-term visa isn't something that I've done in the past, and I've just learned about that as a concept within the last year from Matthew, and it is something considering in the future, but it doesn't need to be as cut and dry. And I think there could be mutually agreeable terms, in the same way when an artist leaves a manager or moves on to a new label or what have you. So I think that from the start of the process, the goal is to bring the artists to the States, have them have a long-term career here, and build from that foundation. And ideally, there's a good relationship between the artist and agent.
I'm just trying to stir up trouble, really.
Lawyers.
Exactly. Does people in your community see it the same way, or is this something that gets talked about?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's interesting because you can strip and talk just about us as humans. It's it's a trust thing, Would you marry the first person who's marry me in a month? Well, no. So you obviously don't know, and it's the music industry is a field full of landmines, and it's a hard place to move in. And I have horror stories for days of people who are so excited and then they disappear, or they your thing doesn't do as well as they thought it did. So then they're not as interested and they're onto something else. So obviously, in that sense, you don't want to be tied up But, you know, if something feels good faith and you trust it and they're like, I really want to develop you in the US and I will sponsor your visa, I'm like, hell yeah, like that's a beautiful thing. So I think it really depends. There's no black or white. But getting your visa just on your own and through, I know Tamizdat does sponsoring, which I've done. It is wonderful because then you're not tied to anything and you're at least, I don't come to perform here, I live here. So my livelihood is not depending on my agent being like, well, I don't want to be your agent anymore because I don't even want to be an agent anymore. Or who knows, you know? It happens.
As a presenter, I think when I see agents who worked on visa for artists, that to me is like a plus. Like I see, like not that I don't trust the art, of course I do, but it's someone else invested on this, and it looks good, and we know that the artist needs support for that. And if there's a hub, like someone, like an agency that has done many of those and are investing in the artist, it looks good for the presenter. It gets us excited too.
Good because you know you're not going to have a surprise at the last minute. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, of course, but not to say that we don't trust the artist, but it's also another someone else is investing, you know. And I wish all the agents approach it like this. Like I wish like if more people are invested in learning about the process, because it is time consuming, but it's also about like once you do once, twice, the third time is easier, right? Like now you know what kind of press quotes work or not, where to go, blah, blah, blah. So if someone else is facilitating that, it shows that they invested, you know, so it looks.
Yeah. Paula's too nice to say what we're both thinking about, which is situations where you book an artist from an international artist and their manager says, oh, yeah, the visas are totally fine. We got it taken care of, no worries. Until like 3 weeks before they're supposed to do the show. And then you find out like, well, it's just tourist visas. And they never ever bothered to get visas because they didn't really realize it was necessary or they sort of avoided thinking about it. And that happens pretty often. So yeah, if you're working with an agency, they have a reputation that's in the game that's going to often, but not always, make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, no, thankfully it never happened with me particularly because I'm kind of annoying. I'm always like, but do you have it? Do you, like, can you show it?
Let me see
throughout
it.
Let me, but I have heard it happen before. And this is another panel. I think that the point that surprises us the most in terms of relationship between the presenter and the artist is actually tax. I hate when that comes up. But this is another panel because it's usually like, oh, but wait, why are you withholding? Like, even though we added it into the contract language and blah, blah, blah. But there's so many nuances. And again, if the agents are aware of it and on top of it, it makes it much easier. Yeah.
When we were planning this panel, we were talking with the folks at APAP about what topics to take on. And I was like, we don't want to talk about taxes. We will do that as a webinar later in the spring. So we will address that. And we have addressed it before, but it's a monster topic. And it's more depressing than visas.
Can I address the concept of entering in as tourists to perform? Oh, we're not very well known. We don't have press, you know, and if this is early in our career, entering the country as a tourist, your name will be Googled at the border. And if they find, oh, there's this performing group that you're affiliated with, they'll then see, oh, you're playing all these places. And you've then, at the start of your career, already put a blemish on your like potential future legal visa situation. So
yeah. Thank you for saying that, so I didn't have to say that. Did you want to say something more, Paula, or you touched on it?
I was just going to say, I heard, unfortunately, happened with a friend of mine that like did what he described. So it does happen. It's sad. Yeah, and then I don't know the consequences, but like they were forbidden to come back for years and years. So yeah, please don't do that.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough, and I think it's not. I mean, I'd like it to be as black and white as you're talking about, but I think the lived experience is, you know, like again back to the South by Southwest example. The rule is that if you're playing an official showcase, which means a nighttime showcase that's part of South by's programming, then you don't need a visa to do that. But if you're playing the Converse All-Stars barbecue in a parking lot at 3 o'clock in the afternoon during South by Southwest, you do need a visa. So is it worth paying $4,000 to get an employment visa in order to play the Converse All-Stars barbecue? Probably not. So do people do it? Yes, they do all the time. And it's illegal. And could they get caught? Yes, they could totally get caught. And I think the thing I'd like to say on this front is if you're an artist and you make that decision to like work in a gray area, that's on you. That's your choice to do with your visa status. And if it goes wrong and you get banned from the US, then that screws up your career. And that's the consequence of your choice. That's fine. If you're a manager or an agent or a presenter and you're counseling an artist to come in under the radar, that's not okay. Because they probably don't understand what they're getting into or don't understand it as well as you are. So this is me being scoldy because this happens a lot. Please don't counsel people in any situation to come in under the radar. And I think there are a number of exceptions where you can come in. There's the Showcase, there's a number of other ones. If you have a question about whether what they're doing could be done on ESTA or on a tourist visa, ask us. That's what we're here for. We can supply template letters that help make this work. We can advise you on how to do that or tell you, no, that is not an exception. I'm just playing a nonprofit benefit and I'm not getting paid. There's no rule about saying that's okay. So if you have a question, ask us, but be sure not to counsel an artist incorrectly, because if they get in trouble and it's on you, that's bad news. Okay, that's my second soapbox. What? No, that's not their job. It is. It's appalling. I want to leave some time for questions, but I want to ask Paula one more question. What do you think of, this is a thorny question to ask in this room, what do you think about the presenter's responsibility to engage in an artist visa process? And I ask this because we work with presenters who are thoroughly engaged in the process. The reason my voice is the way it is because I was at Global Fest last night. And Global Fest is incredibly engaged in the process to the extent that they're like, we want our artists to have visas. And we want those visas to be as long as humanly possible because the whole point of Global Fest is to get somebody signed and get people on the road here. And so let's have the visas ready to roll. So those presenters are really engaged in the process. But I also work with presenters, especially ones that are not in major metropolitan areas and aren't very big, who are like, I can't do that. I don't know how. I don't have resources. If they come to me with visas, great. Otherwise, it's on you. So what's your sense? This is sort of an ethics question. I mean, it's a strategy question, but it's also like, is that a presenter's responsibility, or is it not a question of responsibility?
It's a hard question. I think it's personal in the sense that each organization decides what is a priority, right? I was trying to push to the agent as a responsibility for that. I'm kidding.
Came right back to you there.
I do think it's my approach, and I can only speak for myself, is that it is the presenter's responsibility to at least ensure that they know, they're aware of it. If we have the resources, and again, there are many types of presenters, nonprofit, commercial, tiny clubs, tiny spaces. Of course, each of them will have their different resources and priorities. Being an immigrant myself, I wish all of them felt responsible. That's how I approach it with June, who works with me. But I know it's not common sense. I wish it was. And I have a question for you later. If you can ignore it or you can decide to respond. I remember this whole process changed around 9/11. I wasn't here, but I know it changed during 9/11. Is there any light into the future that, not speaking about fees only, but like, can this whole thing be changed? Like, is there a more logical way to welcome international artists?
I'm going to answer really quickly. It's a great question, and we did touch on that yesterday in the legislation panel. Two answers to it. I'm going to try to be really quick. One, yes, but it would require legislation in Congress. And I don't know, immigration is kind of a big issue, and they don't tend to do much about it. And if they were to do something about it, I think they'd probably be focused on like children in cages at the border rather than artist problems. But probably not. I don't know if that's the case. But getting Congress to change the laws broadly is a big ask, and I don't see it happening in either of the coming administrations that I see. I'd like to think otherwise. I mean, but there may be incremental changes. But here's the thing. Most of the way that it works is not governed by the law so much as the regulations and the procedures and the manuals that the officers use. And those can be changed without Congress. And that's really what APAP and all the arts organizations that are working on are really focused with. We publish a white paper on artist mobility to the US every year, and that's really focused on how do we make incremental changes that will substantially, like without having to change laws, that will substantially streamline the process. I mean, keeping in mind that in 95, when I first did my first visa petition, it was 15 pages long, and the whole process cost $130. And the laws, except for the fees, the laws haven't changed since then. The enforcement of the laws have changed. And so with that same token, that enforcement could be dialed back without Congress. So yes, it could be changed without. There is a version of keeping the laws the way they are, but totally changing the enforcement of it. And that's really what the focus of the advocacy is on. I think I had another soapbox, but I can't remember what it was. We'll probably come back to it. Let's open up for some questions. Do you guys have any more specific? Yes, Mahmood. Wait.
I have one question
Okay.
for Paula and Matthew. So, and sorry to take from that time. Juli and I exist in kind of a realm where it's ticket sales based. They're clubs, they're theaters, and these clubs are ostensibly bars. They're, it's a commercial endeavor. What about if it's an educational institution that's bringing the performer over Princeton or what have you? Can there be another category?
Thank you. Thanks for bringing that up. And I'm really remiss for not having brought that up. There is a weird little exception. I think it's out there. There's a weird little exception to the rule about requiring employment-based visas that applies to academic institutions specifically. And it's really narrow and really complex. But it does open up the possibility that if you are an academic institution of higher education that is degree offering and is accredited, that you may, under certain circumstances, be able to present an international artist without having to get an employment-based visa. There's rules about like how many shows they can do in a specific period of time and how many other institutions they're going. So it's a complex rule. And this is, again, a situation where like if you're an arts presenter at a university or a college, and you're bringing an artist and your HR department is saying you need to get a J1 or you need to get an O1, and you're like, I don't know, come to us because we can tell you how the law works, and we'll even go to bat with you with your HR office, because we have to do that a lot, and say like, you guys are not immigration attorneys, this is how the law works, and often we win. So be aware that there is this weird little loophole. Okay, should we go? We've got some questions, it looks like. I'm gonna say one thing before we start asking questions. If your question is case specific, I'm gonna say come and talk to us afterwards. So don't say, I've got this artist and this is what happened, because unless I can extrapolate up questions that's applicable to everybody, I will probably wanna move on and save time. So go ahead.
Hi, Matthew. Laura
Hi.
Colby with LC Management, and I'm here with my visa department, which is staffed by 2 non-US born people who are here on their own damn visas.
Awesome.
So wow, it's so complex. And we filed our first visa only because the prior manager of that Spanish-based company handed us that last visa he filed. Okay, this was 20 years ago, but we learned by duplication. And I don't know that we would ever use the word easier. We might use the word more familiar, but I totally agree that by repetition, it does get more familiar and you learn more tricks. I'm curious about this association, long-term association with an agent, because I've got that with 10 of our internationally based artists. And we at LC don't represent any dance, we don't represent any music. So it's all dance companies, theater companies, organized companies. So my question is, if we were to try that option. When we file the petition, we have to name names, lots of names. And so would the idea be that we would put in as many names as we could possibly to cover what would presumably maybe be a year-long visa?
Broadly speaking, what I would say is this. You want to include a contract between yourself and the artist to show
Done.
that you have a year-long relationship.
Done.
And then you want to, you have to submit an itinerary. And in a better world, and this is what we're working toward, like if you've got that contract, you wouldn't need to submit the itinerary, but for the moment you have to. What we would do is we would submit an itinerary explicitly being planned, saying on the itinerary, these are the 4 confirmed dates that are happening in April. And then after that, these are the things we think we're going to be doing in the US. And when we're not in the US, we are going to be doing these other things elsewhere to make it clear that they have engagements, so they will be leaving. And I would include that. I would not include contracts for the performances that are confirmed because that's just going to confuse them. Because if you've got your contract and then performance contracts, they're going to be like, what? And then they deny it. So that's what I would do. Does that answer your question?
So that because the visas are in person, literally person by person, they are awarded at the point of interview to the actual people who are going to be on that tour. So I've got performers 1 to 10 coming in April. I don't know who's coming in October.
Oh.
So do I need to include the folks I don't know who are coming in October in that original visa?
Okay, so what you're suggesting is like I've got 5 people who I know are coming. There's a dance company, and there's like 50 members of it that we draw on, and we take people out for certain things. Depending on how it works, generally what I would say is like put as many people as you could possibly have that legitimately are probably coming to you. Like I've got a client musician, again, sorry to use music. I've got an Irish musician who's an 01 of some renown, and he's got about 12 different projects he's working on at all times. So when we do an 02 for him, literally like half the Dublin music scene is on his 02. Because that way he can be like, you play harmonium and you play lute and you play moog. Come with me, and you're the sound guy I want to use this time. So he just chooses which ones he wants, and it becomes a stable for him to work with. And the same thing can kind of be done in the context you're talking about, where let's get a whole P1 for the entire company, and then different people will be drawn out for the different performances over the course of the year. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Sure. Are we out of time? We're not out. Are we out of time?
Someone has a follow-up question to that question, which usually using this scenario of the long-term relationship with the agent. So I've got my representation agreement in that application. Absolutely. Do I need to include the person-by-person contracts that the company has with their performers? Because usually we do have to include those with our straight-up P1s.
You want to show that the beneficiaries, the people who are getting the visas, are party to this and are aware of the relationship. So if you can show that you have so in other words, the contract that you have with the company, if it's a 50-person company, do you have to have all 50 artists sign it? Probably not. But you do want to you want to make some effort to indicate an acknowledgement that the artists are aware of what's being done on their behalf.
A relationship.
That's a broad answer, and I can give you more specific, case-specific stuff. But yeah, I'm sorry, you guys are. We'll come back to you when we can. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Valerie Cusson. I'm a booking agent based in Canada. And I have a question about the proof elements that we need to include in the application. So as you may know, some disciplines and genres are less and less covered by press, such as young audience, dance, and creation theater. We know that press is the main proof we need to include. Is there any alternative we can focus on for some companies that would lack such kind of proof?
So the topic of proof is really, I mean, we've been through this before, and independent artists deal with this all the time. The topic of proof is way more an art than a science. And there are technically 7 different classifications of eligible proof. One, which is the dominant one, which is do you have an international award, in which case all the rest is unnecessary. Then there's 6 more. Press is only one of them. There's 5 others. And if you go to the Artists from Abroad website, it's all listed there. And I think it's really important if you have this kind of question, and if your question surrounds like what kind of proof is enough, to read those, because they're very specific, and one is specifically about what is the compensation you're going to be receiving and how does it relate to others in the field. And then you just pull down union scales and you can say like they're making $100 an hour and union scales 35. Done. Testimonial letters from people in the field are super important. Showing that the artist has had important relationships, like their music was on a toothpaste commercial. Great, let people know that. Show documentation of that. They played at an important festival. They played at Rock in Rio. Great, show that. That's something with renown. It's important also, in the last decade, the notion of secondary evidence has become really important. So if you say, my artist played at Rock in Rio, then that's an important festival, and does it still exist? Yeah. Okay, cool. That's an important festival. They're not going to say, okay, cool. They're going to say, prove to me that Rock in Rio is important. So then you're going to want to include a New York Times article about Rock in Rio. So making sure that you're not just assuming they know what you're talking about, but making sure that you're substantiating the claims that you're making. But there's a lot of different ways to approach it besides just press. And we often work, especially when we're dealing with artists who are coming from the global south, where there is not as in countries where there's not a substantial culture media, we often don't have any press at all. And we have to figure out how to fill in the gaps in other ways. Is that an answer?
And how legit would recognition from our own country, like a Canadian artist receiving a prize in Canada? Because in some cases, I got answers from the Visa Bureau that we needed to get international recognition, so outside of the artist
home country. Okay, for a P, you've got to show that they've got recognition outside their home country. So if you only include information from Canada for a P visa, that's probably not going to work.
Yeah.
If you can show information if you're often top situation, if you're Irish and you can show a bunch of press from England, you're great. That's going to be fine. For an O1, it doesn't matter. It can just be like a Canadian artist can get an O1 based entirely on Canadian press and documentation.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Good afternoon. Thanks for your help. In the past, Jose Corbello from Home Team Management, working with musical artists from South America. We've always gotten P3, culturally unique visas. And I'm wondering, as far as the incorporation of managers, tour managers from the countries, managers of the group, including within the P3 application. We had last year we included a manager within a petition, and it was responded that they were deemed as support personnel, and then they would have to do a P3S. And we tried to make the case, we were doing a lot of university. We made the case that the manager was also an academic, a researcher, wrote the book. Would do all the college presentations and present the group and everything, and they still deemed it. I'm wondering, as far as incorporating managers and people who don't necessarily physically perform up on stage, but are an integral part of the group, how to demonstrate that, or if there's other solutions.
Not really. Unfortunately, there is another solution. If the artist is on stage, if the person is on stage, then they can be on the P1 or the P3. If they are not on stage, then they need to be on a different petition. You're going to get that response from them. Even in the case of a dance company, if you've got a choreographer who actually did the piece, they rarely can be. You can rarely sneak them in with the P1 because they are not on stage. They're not a performer. So there's no solution to that. In terms of a manager, though, they make a distinction between a manager and a road manager. A manager who's coming to the US to network and be at the venues and talk to the agent and whatever, that they generally don't need an employment visa to be here because they're not seen as essential to the tour. They're not doing anything that's essential. Sorry, managers. Road managers, on the other hand, are seen as crew. They are doing work that is necessary for the functioning of the tour, and they would need to be on a separate, that is employment, and they would need to be on a separate petition. Now, there's a thing here. Oftentimes we have this dichotomy between what the law says and what the reality is. And so an example I would like to use is if you've got a band and they're driving from Canada into the US, and it's 4 dudes who are fairly unwashed and unshaven and wearing leather, and they're in a band, and the manager doesn't need a visa, is fairly unwashed and wearing leather, you're going to get to the border and the officer might well say, like, these 4 are the musicians and this is the drummer who forget to get the visa, and I'm going to hold you at the border. Whereas if that manager is in his 60s and sort of overweight and bald, he's going to be fine because the officer is going to look and be like, yeah, you look like a manager, come on in. So just be aware that there's a profiling that's always going to go on, and that what happens at the border might not be exactly what you would think it would be under the law.
So as far as a manager could potentially come up with a tourist visa, or if they have, for example, dual citizen EU passport,
Yep.
They could just come and just say the manager, and they wouldn't necessarily be scrutinized as far as,
Right.
oh, well, you're going to be working, and okay.
Right. So for an event like this, you've got lots of managers who are coming, and they're probably just coming in as tourists, and that's fine. Assuming that they don't look just like their artists, and therefore there's a suspicion that they're actually artists or road managers who are trying to sneak in. That's the thing you got to be careful about. Yeah, arriving separately is a major one. So like if you're a manager and you are wearing leather and are unwashed, maybe fly from Canada and meet the band here, so that so you're legitimate, you're fine, you're a manager, you're not a road manager. It's okay for you to come in without a visa, but you don't want to get that scrutiny because you look the same as the artists. So be careful, fly, meet them when they get there.
And we should not have their name, for example, on the contracts submitted for the P3 visas.
Yeah, well, I mean, you wouldn't include the road manager as an artist on the contract because they're not.
Right. Thank you.
Sure. Are we out of time? No, we've got some time left. I'm sorry, I don't feel like I'm including you. Okay, sorry. Okay, go for it.
Hi there, I'm Michael Grafsorian. I represent jazz musicians from Europe and musicians from South America, principally Brazil. I've been doing this work, been doing visa work since 2010. The good news is, in spite of RFEs from time to time, I've never been rejected. But because I'm either devoted or stupid or both, I've been doing that work myself. I also do the tax work. I also have played itinerary game. So I have a number of questions. The first one was, I was one of those 4,000 people who protested the increase back whenever that was. I've had it on my mental radar that for tours I've got coming up at 24, 25, that I have a deadline before March to get those petitions in, because what I understood until now, it's going to be that fee increase. So that's one question. Another is...
Can I just answer that?
Please.
Yeah, we don't know. We honestly don't know. I know that there's going to be, they are saying they're going to issue a final ruling. We met with them, with Homeland Security and State Department in October, and they seemed very transparent and open and aware of the advocacy that had been done and sympathetic with it. But what happens in the corridors of power is beyond the scope of what I know. So I mean, we could well have a nasty surprise, or we could not have a surprise at all. No way to know.
So the thing you've mentioned that has been revealed many times, the agent relationship thing, of course, is of great interest to me, because it takes literally a full week to put an O1 together. And so I'm on everybody this on a handshake deal with all my artists. I have the form, I can create the contract. Is the date on the contract relationship between agent and artist critical to establish, or how does one establish longevity? Because I've worked with these people since 2006.
For the sake of showing their renown?
No, for the sake of showing, if I'm going to go the route, not the itinerary and letters of invitation route, if I'm going to go that other route, never done before, which is I'm showing that I have a long-term relationship with the musician.
Right.
And therefore, I can show the gigs I have booked, which I always do. I don't make a decision if I don't have gigs. But it's that second and third year out on the 01 that I've been able to get because I help.
Right.
But if I'm going to go this other route, how do I document to SCIS that I have had?
You don't technically have to document the fact that you have those engagements. In fact,
Okay.
you kind of shouldn't, because that will confuse them.
Right.
What you want to do is you want to document your contractual relationship with the artist with a valid visa that covers the full duration, or with a valid contract that covers the full duration.
So does contract, though, have to be, I mean, I'm thinking I should have had a contract dated 2010.
No, just date, as long, it doesn't matter what the contract is dated, as long as it covers the visa period that you're looking for.
Okay.
Yeah, future-facing contract. Sure, you can do that. But that would be more of like a cover letter, whereas the contract itself just needs to be like, we're in this contract, we're bound together, and we will be bound for the duration that we're seeking.
Is there anything in writing on this approach?
That's a good question. It is explained to some extent on the Artists from Abroad website. Yeah, I think you can find some information there on that.
I mean, I've worked with Andy Floyd since 2010. So I'm Andy Floyd.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Andy
Work-
does this stuff. She knows all this stuff.
Okay, so I just ask her about this approach.
Yep.
Lastly, I would say about the question you raised to Paula about the responsibility of the presenter. It's really on the agent to get this done. And so I would hope that the word gets put out that when an agent who really is crazy enough to do all this stuff says, can you give me a letter, that there would be sympathetic ears for that. Because that's what we, unless we go this other route, which I'm a little nervous about because I've never done it. I'm batting 1,000. Well,
Yeah. I mean, I hear you. I also know that in certain situations, if there's management, the management would, you know, if I was an agent and the artist had a manager in the US, I'd be like, this isn't my job. This is the manager's job. If there's no management, then I might say like, ugh, now I got to deal with this. Okay, thank you.
Yes, I'm Kathy Barbash. I'm an independent producer, and I also run the Barbash Bach competition.
right, okay.
So what is the best strategy for competitions where the prize includes, in addition to money, engagements, but the engagements are with different presenters at dates TA in the
Right.
future?
So we talked about showcases. We talked about academic situations. We didn't talk about events that are sponsored by embassies and consulates, which is another narrow exception. And we didn't talk about competitions. So competitions is a situation where if there is no payment other than a prize money, then an artist can, in some situations, perform in the U.S. I've talked to music festivals that thought about, well, what if we just become a massive battle of the bands? Could we then not have to have any visas? I was like, well, if you want to deal with how that looks, then fine. But I think your question is not so much.
Part of the prize is that they receive paying professional engagements in the future.
Right. So the problem with that is, while arguably that event, the initial event,
Right.
artists would not need visas for those paid events that are subsequent, they're going to need visas for those.
Right,
By
and
visa,
right.
I mean employment visas.
Right, and since there are a variety, let's say 3 or 4 different presenters, does each presenter do their own,
Well,
or
they
does
could, but you
or
wouldn't
does
want
the
to, because that's
competition, or you ask the, in the case of, because,
There's a lot of different ways you could do that. What you're saying, the one question sort of underlying that is, if you've got a tour, do you need to file different petitions for different gigs? And you could, but you definitely would not want to, because that's unnecessary. So a lot of times presenters will come together. Like it's often the East Coast presenter that is, for a European artist, is going to be the one is like, we're putting together a tour, we'll be the petitioner because we're the first gig. And then the artist goes off and does, a U.S. tour based around that. So Or oftentimes, Tamizdat will act as a petitioner on behalf of a bunch of presenters, or an agent will act as the petitioner on behalf of a bunch of gigs or presenters. So there's a lot of different ways to do that, but definitely you don't want to have a bunch of petitions being filed at the same time, because that's a total
In this
waste.
scenario, wouldn't a factor be the timeline between when the competition is and when those subsequent performances are?
Totally.
Like if it's like, oh, the day after the competition, you go off on those performances, then you have an issue. But if there's a year, then you deal
Right,
with it after the fact.
we're realizing that.
Yeah. So if it's
And
like,
also part of the prize should be the visa support.
yeah, I would say that. So, but seriously, if it's a situation where there's a competition and then like you won tomorrow, you're going to play this venue, and then yes, you'd have to address that in advance.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hello.
0? 2 minutes. Okay.
Great. I'm Stacy Meshbane from Holden and Arts Associates. I'm another agent that works with primarily touring theater and dance, and this whole idea of being able to get a visa based on our relationship with the artist instead of a tour-based itinerary with all the contracts is very intriguing. I'm just curious, have you seen, it sounds like this is a pretty common route with musicians, which makes a lot of sense in the timeline of how those dates get booked. Have you seen many examples of theater or dance groups getting that kind of visa as well? I've been doing this for so long, I'm surprised that I haven't encountered this.
It depends a little bit on whether there's an agent involved, or whether there's a recurring relationship between a venue and the dance company. So, for example, if you've got a dance company that is doing regular performances over a period of time, then that might be a contract that is a long-term one rather than specific engagements. Or if there's an agent, it's a little bit more complex in that situation. What I want to say, because we're out of time, we're pretty much out of time, is this is important because it's a significant way to not be doing fraud, which is important, and getting long-term visas, which is financially really important. So if this is something that sounds appealing and interesting to you, but you don't know how to do it, feel free to reach out to me and we can talk about it.
Thank you.
That's that answer. I want to give you guys a chance for closing thoughts, if you have anything that you want to say, but you don't have to.
Good luck.
I'll just add one quick thing. When artists do the visa themselves, I've been looking at Juli, I fully congratulate them. And it's an incentive to work with them because it's so hard. So they have their shit together. So do work with artists that do the visa themselves. I want to say that.
Totally.
I'll do a really quick rant. It's for specifically for music, and this is like an elephant in the room. It's like, how are you going to develop an artist if a support tour is going to give them $500 a night and touring the U.S. with a 4-piece band for $500 a night? It's just not possible. Or you have funding from somewhere else, or your parents are rich and they can pay for it. I'm just saying, it's hard. It's much harder than it sounds because fees and even festival fees for beginning bands are not that high, and travel costs are so high. So good luck. Sorry, it is hard, but you can do it.
Yeah, well, or not, or you can't. And that's actually the topic that I do a lot of this kinds of conversations in Europe and around the world. And it kind of falls under the are we export ready to the US? And usually the answer is probably not. Probably if you're a new artist in Germany or if you're a new artist in Colombia, both in terms of the press and in terms of the money, getting pretty big at home is the easiest way to get into the US.
Also, the conversion rate for at least South
Sure.
America means that a $500,000 visa is it's like $20,000 of the living expense there. So
I think we're out of time, right? That's the sign from the corner. Thank you so much. Thank you, APAP. Thank you, illustrious panelists. Appreciate you all coming.